Some secrets get buried out of fear, some out of love, and some, when they finally crawl into the light, can bring an entire empire to its knees. 6 years ago, Marin Blythe faked her own death and disappeared with 2 heartbeats no one knew existed. Today, those 2 heartbeats walked through the most dangerous door in Portland, alone, calm, and carrying a folder thick enough to end a man's world. Their father's world. And Silas Vane, the most feared name in organized crime on the West Coast, is about to learn that the greatest threat to his empire wasn't a rival, a federal agent, or a traitor inside his ranks. It was the children he never knew he had. If this story hits you, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and follow so I can see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning started like every other morning in the Vane building. Cold, efficient, and slightly threatening. 41 floors above street level, the executive floor smelled like leather and climate-controlled air, and the particular kind of silence that money buys when it wants to make a point. The carpet was dark charcoal. The windows ran floor to ceiling, offering an unbroken view of Portland's skyline wrapped in November gray. Everything on that floor had been chosen deliberately. The furniture, the lighting, the staff, the quiet. Nothing existed there without Silas Vane's approval. Dominic Harp, head of building security for 11 years, was reviewing the morning rotation at the main desk when the elevator chimed. He didn't look up immediately. The executive floor wasn't accessible without a key card, a fingerprint scan, and a secondary badge authorization. The system had never been breached. In 11 years, not once. So when the elevator doors opened and 2 children walked out, Dominic looked up slowly, the way a man looks at something that shouldn't be possible. They were young, maybe 10, 11 at the outside. A girl and a boy, both slight, both wearing clean clothes that weren't expensive but were pressed. Someone had made sure of that. The girl carried a dark canvas bag over one shoulder. The boy held a manila folder against his chest with both hands, the kind of careful grip that suggested the contents mattered more than anything else he'd ever held. They walked out of the elevator like they owned the floor. Dominic was on his feet before the doors finished closing. "Hey, stop, right there." The girl stopped. The boy stopped half a step behind her, which told Dominic immediately who made the decisions between them. "How did you get up here?" he said, moving around the desk. The girl looked at him. Her eyes were pale gray, almost colorless in the office light, and there was something in them that didn't belong on a child's face, a kind of measuring stillness, like she was cataloging him. "Service elevator," she said. "The access code is 7741 pound. Your IT contractor changed it 3 weeks ago, but didn't update the master log. There's a 12-minute window between 8:40 and 8:52 when the secondary camera on sublevel 2 goes into maintenance cycle. We came up during that window." Dominic stared at her. The boy spoke without looking up from his folder. "We're not here to cause a problem. We need 5 minutes with Mr. Vane." "You're—" Dominic stopped himself. He looked from one child to the other. Something was wrong with this picture in a way he couldn't name yet, a wrongness that lived below logic and sat right at the base of his neck. "Who sent you?" "Nobody," the girl said. "We came on our own." "Kids don't just—" "We're aware," she said, and her voice didn't change. No impatience, no fear, no performance. Just fact. "We've been planning this for 4 months. We know Mr. Vane's morning schedule, his security rotation, and his usual disposition before his 9:15 call. We chose this window because he's typically alone and the least reactive before the markets open." She tilted her head slightly. "We'd like to use the time we have left." Dominic had his hand on his earpiece. The boy finally looked up. His eyes were darker than his sister's, a deep brown, almost black. But they had the same quality of stillness, the same absence of the anxiety a normal child would be drowning in right now. "Please don't call Mr. Vane's personal detail," he said quietly. "If armed men come into this conversation before we have a chance to speak, it's going to go badly for everyone. We're not a threat, but we carry information that is, and Mr. Vane needs to hear it from us directly." Dominic's hand hovered near the earpiece. He'd worked for Silas Vane for 11 years. He'd seen a lot of things that couldn't be explained in polite company. He'd learned a long time ago that the most dangerous situations weren't the ones that announced themselves loudly. They were the quiet ones, the ones that walked out of elevators on floors they shouldn't be able to reach, carrying folders and speaking like adults in borrowed child bodies. He pressed the earpiece. "Mr. Vane, I need 60 seconds of your time." Silas Vane was standing at the window when Dominic's voice came through. He had a coffee cup in one hand, so black, no sugar, the only concession to normalcy in his morning. And he was watching a cargo vessel move through the gray river below with the focused disinterest of a man whose mind was operating 3 conversations ahead of his body. He was 44 years old, lean in the way that suggested discipline rather than genetics, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that had been described at various points in his life as cold, handsome, and dangerous, usually in that order. He listened to Dominic's 60 seconds. Then he set the coffee down. "Send them in," he said. There was a pause on the other end. "Sir." "Send them in, Dom." He turned from the window and waited. The door opened. The 2 children walked in. Dominic hovered in the doorway behind them, visibly uncertain, and Silas looked at him once, a single flat look, and Dominic pulled the door shut from the outside. Silas studied them. The girl was first, the way she'd apparently been first about everything. She had her bag on her shoulder, and she was looking at him the way people rarely looked at him anymore, directly, without the nervous energy that most people couldn't suppress in his presence. The boy was half a step behind, folder still in both hands, watching Silas with an expression that wasn't quite caution, but wasn't quite comfort either. They were fine-boned. Both of them, dark hair. The girl's eyes were that unusual gray, the boy's nearly black. Silas had been running criminal operations for 20 years. He had a talent, cultivated, honed, paid for in blood, for reading people instantly, threat levels, loyalties, breaking points. He could walk into a room and within 30 seconds know who was lying, who was afraid, and who was already making a move. These children were not afraid. That fact alone was enough to make something shift in the back of his mind. "You have 5 minutes," he said. His voice was level. It was always level. "Use them." The girl reached into her bag and produced a second folder, thicker than the boy's. She set it on his desk without being invited to approach, which was a breach of the unspoken protocol everyone observed in this office. And somehow she did it like the protocol didn't apply to her. "My name is Calla," she said. "This is my brother Knox. We're 10 years old." She paused for exactly 1 beat. "We're your children." The room did not change. The gray light from the windows didn't shift. The building's ventilation hum didn't alter. Nothing moved. But something happened to Silas Vane's face. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the way faces break in movies. No gasp, no step backward, no visible collapse. It was smaller than that and worse. A single moment where every calculated layer he kept on his expression slipped, just slightly, like a mask that had been glued on for so long he'd forgotten it wasn't his actual face. And underneath it, for 1 fraction of a second, was something raw and unguarded and completely without armor. Then it was gone. "That's a significant claim," he said. His voice hadn't changed. "Points to him." Knox spoke for the first time since entering the room. He opened his folder and set a single sheet on the desk beside the one Calla had placed. "DNA isn't in there," he said. "We know you'd want to verify independently, but the documentation of our birth, our mother's identity, her connection to you, and the timeline, it's all there. It'll hold." Silas did not look at the folder. He looked at them. The girl, Calla. The boy, Knox. 10 years old, born when 6 years ago he would have been. And 6 years ago there had been a woman. One woman in a life that had contained very few of them that mattered. Her name was Marin. She was the one who got out. The one he'd let get out, which was not something he'd ever admitted to anyone, including himself. She disappeared 14 months after she'd left him. There had been a car, a fire, a body that took 3 weeks to identify from dental records because there wasn't much left. He had not gone to a funeral. He had not allowed one to be arranged. He had simply marked it, internally, as a closed door. The way he marked most things that hurt. "Where's your mother?" he said. Not a question. The inflection didn't curve at the end. It landed like a statement of intent. Calla looked at him steadily. "Safe." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're getting today." She nodded at the folder. Read what we brought. Then we'll talk about what comes next. Silas picked up the folder. What? He didn't read it right then. He dismissed them, politely, which surprised even him, to a secondary conference room with Dominic posted outside, sent for food they probably hadn't eaten yet because they'd clearly been managing logistics all morning, and stood alone in his office with the folder in his hands for a long time before he opened it. When he did, he read it the way he read everything, completely, without skipping, absorbing every detail before forming any conclusion. It took 20 minutes. Birth certificates. 2 of them, issued in Oregon under names he didn't recognize. Not Blythe, not Vane, not anything connected. Mother listed by a name he didn't know. Father listed as unknown. But attached behind the certificates were photographs. A woman 7 months pregnant, face angled away from the camera, but the jawline recognizable in the way certain things are recognizable when you've memorized them without meaning to. Hospital intake records. An apartment lease and a name that didn't exist anymore. A utility account, a grocery store loyalty card, a pediatrician's patient file with 2 names on it, Kala, Knox. And then, paper clipped to the back, a photograph he hadn't expected, printed on plain paper, slightly pixelated, clearly pulled from some source the children had accessed without authorization. It was him, walking into this building 14 months ago, 2 weeks after the supposed accident. His face was clear. His expression was what it always was, closed, functional, undisturbed. Written across the bottom in a child's handwriting, neat, careful, already showing the precision of someone who'd practiced at it, were 7 words. We needed to know you were still here. Silas set the folder down. He pressed both hands flat on his desk and looked at the skyline and did not move for a long time. He sent for them again at noon. They'd eaten. The food had been taken in, plates came back clean, which told him they were practical rather than proud. Dominic reported they'd spent the intervening hours mostly quiet, the girl reading something on a small tablet she'd produced from her bag, the boy writing in a notebook with a focus that Dominic described as unnerving, honestly. Silas had spent the morning canceling 3 meetings and doing something he almost never did, nothing, just thinking. When they came back into his office, he was seated this time, behind his desk, deliberate positioning, and they sat across from him in the chairs that visitors used, which most visitors found themselves slightly too far back in, a subtle architectural choice that put the desk between Silas and the rest of the world. Kala sat at the front edge of her chair. Knox sat back, watching. I'm going to ask you some questions, Silas said. Okay, Kala said. Where have you been living? Portland. Different neighborhoods. We've moved 4 times. With your mother? Yes. Who else knows you're here today? Kala's expression flickered. Not fear, but something careful. Nobody. Your mother doesn't know you're here. A pause, half a second, which was enough. No. Silas looked at Knox. You agree with that answer? Knox met his eyes. She would have stopped us, he said simply. And you chose to come anyway. Yes. Silas leaned back. The leather of his chair made no sound. Why? It was Kala who answered, and she answered like she'd been rehearsing it for a long time. Not the words, but the honesty behind them. Like she'd decided before she walked in that she wasn't going to perform anything. Because we found your business records, she said. Knox found the digital trail first. I found the paper connections. We spent 6 months mapping what your organization actually does. She held his gaze. We needed to know what we came from, who you actually were. Not what Mom told us, no offense to her, but the real version, the documented version. And what did you find? Silas said, and his voice was very quiet. Knox opened his folder again and took out a single page. A clean summary, organized in columns, and even from across the desk, Silas could see the precision of it. The kid had structured it like a financial audit. Revenue streams, operational structure, known enforcement hierarchy, cross-reference with federal indictment filings from the last 8 years. Knox looked up. We know what you run. We know how it runs. We know what it costs. Costs, Silas repeated. People, Kala said. We know what it costs in people. The room was very quiet. You came here to condemn me, Silas said. No. Calla shook her head, and there was something almost fierce in it. If we'd wanted to condemn you, we'd have sent the folder to a journalist. We know 3 who cover organized crime in this region. We have their contact information. She met his eyes. We came here because we wanted to know if condemnation was what you deserved, or something else. Silas studied her for a long moment. This child, his child, if the documentation was what it appeared to be, had just told him that she'd had the means to destroy him and chosen not to use it. Not yet. That the decision was still open. That she was sitting across from him not as a victim or a supplicant, but as something much more uncomfortable. A judge who hadn't reached a verdict. "What does your mother know?" he said. "About what you found?" "Nothing," Knox said. "She doesn't talk about you, not really. When we ask, she gives us—" He paused, looking for the word, "edited versions." "She's not lying. She's just protecting us from details she thinks would hurt." "She's been protecting you from me," Silas said. "She's been protecting us from what you are," Calla corrected, and the distinction in her voice was clean and precise. "She never said you were a bad person. She said you made bad choices. That the world you chose wasn't safe for us." She tilted her head. "We wanted to find out if she was right." "And?" Calla looked at the folders, then at him. "We're still deciding." He didn't let them leave that afternoon without extracting one thing, a phone number. Not Marin's, Calla wouldn't give him that, and he didn't push because pushing 10-year-old children for their mother's location sat wrong in a way he didn't have immediate language for, but a number that reached them. A prepaid cell Knox produced from his jacket pocket. "We figured you'd want this," Knox said, setting it on the desk. "We bought 3 of them. Mom uses one for emergencies. This one's ours." Silas looked at the phone. Small, cheap, unremarkable. The kind you buy with cash and no paperwork. "You prepared for this conversation to go badly," he said. "We prepared for every version of how it could go," Calla said. "That's not pessimism. That's just planning." He walked them to the elevator himself, which was not something Silas Vane did for anyone. Dominic watched from down the hall with an expression Silas chose not to acknowledge. In the elevator doorway, Knox turned back. He had his folder under his arm again, and his dark eyes were steady and serious in a way that made him look momentarily much older than 10. "There's something else in the folder," he said. "Page 14. You should read it before you make any calls tonight." The elevator closed. Silas went back to his office and found page 14. It was a single sheet, different from the others. Not official documentation, not a record or certificate. It was a timeline. Handwritten, Knox's careful script, covering a period of 8 months. It detailed, with dates, cross-referenced locations, and 3 attached photographs, a pattern of surveillance on Marin Blythe that did not originate from Silas's organization. Somebody else was watching her. Somebody who had known she was alive for at least 8 months and had not yet moved. Somebody who was waiting for something. Silas set the page down on his desk. His jaw was tight. His hands were very still. Outside, 41 floors below, Portland went about its gray November afternoon without any idea that in the highest office of the Vane building, a man who had not felt fear in 20 years was feeling something close to it. Not for himself, which would have been manageable, but for 2 children he hadn't known existed this morning, and a woman he'd spent 6 years believing was dead. He picked up his private phone, the one with no traceable number, no log, no carrier record. He dialed the only man he trusted with the kind of task he was about to assign. "I need a location," he said when the line connected. "Not from our systems. Clean pull, nothing that touches our network. The name is Blythe. First name Marin." He paused. "And I need it before dark." He hung up. Outside, the river moved. The city breathed. The cargo vessel from this morning was gone from sight. And somewhere in Portland, Marin Blythe had no idea that her carefully constructed world had just cracked open, that her children had walked into the one room she'd built her entire life to keep them out of, and that the man she'd run from, the man she'd let the world believe was dead to her, was now sitting in the dark of his empire with her name on his lips and a page of surveillance photographs in his hands, asking a question she'd never prepared an answer for. How do you hide from someone who finally has a reason to look? Marin didn't know it yet. She was 40 minutes away, in the kitchen of a second-floor apartment on the edge of the Selwood neighborhood, standing at the stove with a dish towel over her shoulder and the particular low-grade anxiety she'd carried in her body for 6 years humming somewhere behind her sternum. It never fully went away. She'd learned to live around it the way you learn to live around an old injury, compensating for it so automatically that some days she forgot it was there, and then something small would happen. A car she didn't recognize parked too long on the street, a name that sounded wrong on the news, the twins coming home from school 10 minutes late, and the anxiety would flare up sharp and complete in reminder that it was always there. It had never left. She was making soup because it was a Tuesday, and on Tuesdays she made soup. Routine was armor. She'd understood that from the beginning. Routine made you harder to see. The twins were supposed to be home by 4. It was 4:17 when her phone buzzed. Not the number she expected. The prepaid. The emergency one. The one she'd given Calla for situations she never wanted to have to use. She picked it up. One message, Calla's name on the screen. Mom, we need to talk when we get home. Don't be scared. We're okay. But something happened today that you need to know about. Marin read it twice. Then she turned the stove off. Her hands were perfectly steady. That was the thing about 6 years of controlled fear. It trained your hands to be steady even when everything behind your eyes was screaming. She set the phone face down on the counter. She pressed both palms flat on the edge of the sink and looked out the small window above it at the narrow strip of backyard. The apple tree she'd planted in the first spring, the painted fence, the ordinary suburban rectangle of grass that she'd chosen precisely because it looked like nothing, like nobody. Something happened today. She breathed. In, out, slow and deliberate. She was a woman who had faked her own death, rebuilt herself from the pieces, raised 2 extraordinary children in the quiet and the ordinary and the careful. And she had done it all on the sustained belief that if she was patient enough and invisible enough and good enough at staying small, the world she'd run from would eventually stop mattering. She heard the front door open at 4:23. 2 pairs of footsteps on the stairs, familiar, recognizable. The specific rhythm of her children moving through the space that was theirs. The sound that was the whole reason she'd done everything. She turned from the window. They came into the kitchen together the way they always came into rooms. Calla first, Knox just behind. They were still wearing their school clothes, backpacks on, and they looked at her with faces that were trying, visibly and not entirely successfully, to stay neutral. Marin looked at them for a long moment. She said very quietly, "Where were you today?" Neither of them answered immediately. That was answer enough. The anxiety behind her sternum stopped being low grade. "Calla," she said, "where were you?" Calla set her bag down on the kitchen chair. She straightened up and looked at her mother with those gray eyes that Marin had spent 10 years watching and loving and secretly fearing because they were not her eyes. They were his, transplanted into her daughter's face, carrying the same cold precision that had made Marin fall in love with him, and then run from him, and then grieve for him, and then never quite stop. "We went to see him," Calla said. The kitchen was very small. Suddenly it felt smaller. "No," Marin said, and her voice came out wrong. Too thin, too high, stripped of the steadiness she'd built. "No, that's... You couldn't have..." "Vain building," Knox said, not unkindly. 41st floor. We were there from about 8:50 to approximately 1 in the afternoon. Marin sat down. Not gracefully. Her legs made the decision before she did, and she was in the kitchen chair with her hands in her lap, staring at her children, and the room was tilting in a way that had nothing to do with the physical world. "He knows," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Calla said. "He knows you exist." "Yes." "He knows." Marin stopped. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Breathed. "Does he know where we are?" "We didn't tell him," Knox said. "But Mom..." He hesitated, and that hesitation was so uncharacteristic, so unlike the precise certainty her son moved through the world with, that it hit her harder than anything else. "There's something else. Something we found. Something he needs to know about. He needs..." Marin looked at her son, her daughter, the 2 faces she had restructured her entire existence to protect. "You walked into his office," she said slowly. "You walked into Silas Vane's office, and you told him..." "That we're his," Calla said. Yes. Calla. Marin's voice broke on the name. Just once, just a fracture. Then she pulled it back together because she had practice at that too. Do you understand what you've done? Yes, Calla said. And she said it the way she said most things. Not defiant, not apologetic, just certain. We understand exactly what we've done. And Mom, now Calla's voice changed, dropped slightly, lost one thin layer of its composure. We also understand why you ran. We read everything. We know what his organization does. We know why you were afraid. She crossed the kitchen and crouched in front of Marin's chair, which she had to do because Marin was sitting and Calla was still small enough that crouching made them eye level. We know you did it for us. Marin stared at her daughter. But he was watching you, Knox said from behind Calla's shoulder. Not him, someone else. Someone connected to his world but not loyal to him. They've been tracking you for 8 months, Mom. We mapped it. The pattern is, it's escalating. Something's about to happen. He paused. He's the only person with the resources to stop it. Marin heard herself say from very far away, You told him about the surveillance. Page 14 of the folder, Knox confirmed. He'll move on it tonight. She looked at her children, her extraordinary, terrifying, brilliant children who had walked into the empire she'd spent 6 years keeping them out of, carrying evidence and plans, and the specific fearlessness of people who had never been taught to see their father as a monster, and so had gone to find out for themselves what he was. And she thought, he's going to find us. Not might, not could, was going to. Because Silas Vane, whatever else he was, had never failed to find something once he decided he was looking for it. She knew that. She'd counted on his grief, on the closed-door logic of a man who marked losses and moved forward. She'd given him a body to grieve and a door to close. But the door was open now. Her children had opened it, and somewhere across the city, in an office 41 floors above the river, the man she had loved and fled and mourned and never fully stopped thinking about was holding a page with her name on it and making phone calls in the dark. Marin Blythe sat in her kitchen in the Selwood neighborhood and looked at her children and felt the 6 years of careful, constructed safety dissolve around her like paper and water. Pack a bag, she said. Calla shook her head. Calla, we're not running, Calla said. Not this time. And the worst part, the part that made Marin's chest tighten until she couldn't breathe, was that her 10-year-old daughter said it with the absolute, unmovable certainty of someone who had already decided, and there was nothing in that gray gaze that left room for argument. Outside, the November dark was coming in fast, swallowing the street, the apple tree, the fence. Somewhere in the city, a phone was ringing. The call came at 7:14 in the evening. Marin was still in the kitchen. She hadn't moved much in the 2 hours since the twins had told her. She'd made tea she didn't drink, stood at the window twice without seeing anything, and sat back down. Calla had eventually migrated to the couch with her tablet. Knox was at the kitchen table with his notebook, writing something in that focused, closed-off way he had, the pen moving steadily across the page like the act of recording was itself a form of control. She watched him and thought, he gets that from his father. The prepaid buzzed on the counter, not the twins' line, hers. The one she kept for emergencies that she'd never expected to actually use. Unknown number. She knew before she answered. She picked it up, pressed it to her ear, said nothing. A pause on the other end. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Long enough that a different kind of man would have filled it with something. A greeting, a threat, an explanation. Silas didn't fill silences. He never had. He let them sit and do their work. Then, "You're not dead." His voice was exactly the same. That was the thing that hit her first. Not the words, not the fact of the call, but the voice, which was the same low, controlled, carefully uninflected thing it had always been. And hearing it was like pressing a bruise she'd forgotten she had. "No," she said. Another pause. "The car," he said. "Yes." "You planned it." "Yes." She heard him breathe. Just once, a single measured exhale. "How long did it take you to set it up?" 3 weeks. She was surprised by how steady her own voice was. "I needed the records to hold. The dental. That took the longest." "They held." he said. I know. Silence again. Longer this time. She pressed her back against the kitchen wall and looked at Knox, who had stopped writing and was watching her with his dark, too still eyes. She turned away from him. Where are you? Silas said. That's not something I'm going to tell you. Marin. Not tonight, she said. Not like this. Not over a phone. She heard something shift on his end. A chair, maybe, or a position. The small physical adjustments of a man recalibrating. The folder your son put together, he said. Page 14. I know about it. Then you know someone's been sitting on your location for 8 months. You know they haven't moved yet. You know that means they're waiting for something to change or someone to give an order. His voice dropped slightly, not softer, just lower. Something changed today. The bruise deepened. Our children walked into your office, she said. Yes. And now the calculation is different, because now someone knows you have a reason to care about a location you didn't know existed this morning. She closed her eyes. I know how this works, Silas. I lived inside it for 2 years. I understand the mechanics. Then you understand that you need to move. I understand that we need to move, and I understand that my daughter won't. She laughed, and it came out wrong. Too short, too sharp, nothing funny in it. She's 10 years old, and she told me no. Silence from his end, and then something she hadn't expected. The very faint suggestion of something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite pain, somewhere in the texture of his quiet. She gets that from you, he said. She gets it from both of us, Marin said, which is the problem. He came the next morning. She'd known he would. She'd spent the night telling herself she didn't know, and then lying in bed at 2 a.m. fully understanding that she was lying to herself, and he would come, and there was nothing to do about it except decide how to be standing when he arrived. She was in the kitchen again, but coffee this time, actually drinking it, when the knock came at the front door. Measured. 3 knocks, space between each one. Not aggressive. Not the knock of a man used to doors being opened for him. Just deliberate. She opened it. Silas Vane was standing on her front porch in a dark coat, no tie, and he looked, she catalogued this immediately, against her will, like a man who had not slept. It was in the set of his jaw, and the particular flatness around his eyes, and the way he was holding himself with the extra deliberateness of someone compensating for exhaustion. He was still imposing. That hadn't changed. He took up space in a way that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with some quality he'd always had, a gravity, a density, that made rooms feel smaller. He looked at her. She looked at him. 6 years collapsed between them like a bad bridge. Not spanning the distance, but proving the distance had always been there. You look the same, he said. Don't, she said. He didn't. He dropped it immediately, which was either respect or tactical adjustment, and she couldn't tell which, and that inability was familiar too. She'd spent 2 years not being able to tell with him. She stepped back from the door. Not an invitation exactly, more like a concession to the inevitable. He came inside. What? The twins were in the living room. They'd known he was coming. She suspected Calla had tracked something, a vehicle or a pattern, because nothing about Calla's morning had suggested surprise. When Silas walked into the living room, both children stood up, which was an instinct Marin hadn't taught them, and which therefore meant something. Silas stopped in the middle of the room. He looked at them for a long time, long enough that it stopped being a casual look and became something else, an accounting, a reckoning, the particular focus of a man seeing something he hadn't believed was real until this moment. In his office, with the desk between them and the professional armor of his territory, it had been possible to process them as a problem. Here, in a living room with mismatched furniture and a half-finished school project on the coffee table and their faces tipped up toward him, he looked like he'd been hit, not dramatically, not in any way he would have allowed to be visible in any other context, just a small, involuntary contraction around his eyes. "You're taller than I expected," he said finally. It was such a useless thing to say and so completely unlike him that Marin felt something crack slightly in her chest. Knox tilted his head. "We're in the 91st percentile for our age group," he said. "Both of us." Silas looked at him. "Of course you are." Calla crossed her arms. Not hostile. Evaluating. "You came alone." "Yes." Nobody knows you're here. One person, Silas said. Dominic, he drove. He paused. He won't tell anyone. Does he know why you're here? No. Calla considered this. Apparently it passed some internal threshold. She uncrossed her arms. Okay. Maren looked at her daughter and thought, when did you become the one who decides what's okay in my house? But she said nothing, because the answer was probably somewhere around the moment Calla stopped being afraid of anything, which had been so early in her life that Maren couldn't actually pinpoint it. Sit down, Maren said to Silas, because someone had to say something adult. He sat. The chair in the corner, not the couch. He chose the position that put his back to the wall and gave him a sightline to both windows and the hallway, and he did it without appearing to think about it, which meant it was so deeply habitual it had become instinct. Maren sat across from him. The twins sat together on the couch, the four of them in the small living room, the world's most dysfunctional family portrait. Tell me about the surveillance, Maren said. Not the summary, the actual detail, Chapeau. He laid it out cleanly. She'd always respected that about him. When he was communicating information, there was no fat on it, no performance, just the structure of facts in their logical order. The surveillance had begun 8 months ago. 2 vehicles, rotating. A third point of observation from a building across the street that had changed tenants 7 months back. The pattern suggested a professional team. Not federal, the behavioral signatures were wrong, but organized, patient, and coordinated by someone with resources. Leland Cross, Silas said, and the name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Maren knew the name. She'd learned it during her 2 years inside Silas's world. A faction head older than Silas, deeply connected to the organization's previous leadership, someone who had accepted Silas's ascent with the surface compliance of a man who never accepted anything. He's been building a case, Silas said. Not a legal one, a leverage case. He's been collecting information about things I care about, things I'd act to protect. He paused. He didn't know about you, about them. Until yesterday, he had nothing on me that I couldn't absorb or neutralize. But now we exist, Calla said. Silas looked at her. Yes? Because we went to your office. Yes. Knox had his notebook open. He was writing while Silas talked, which should have seemed rude and somehow didn't. It felt like the most natural thing in the world for Knox to be building a secondary record of everything said in this room. Cross has people inside your organization, Knox said without looking up. We identified 3 possible contact points in your financial structure. Someone's been feeding him information for at least 14 months. He turned the notebook around on the coffee table so Silas could see the page. We think it's someone at the operational level, not the executive level. The gaps in the information pattern are consistent with someone who has access but not complete visibility. Silas leaned forward and looked at the notebook page. He was quiet for a moment. You're 10, he said. Yes, Knox said. You built this from publicly accessible information. And some that wasn't, Knox said evenly, but we were careful about how we accessed it. Maren pressed the bridge of her nose with 2 fingers. Knox. It's accurate, Knox said. That matters more than how we got it. Silas looked at Knox for a moment with an expression that Maren recognized in her own gut as something she'd seen on his face before. The specific look of a man confronting something that exceeded his expectations and didn't know yet whether that was good or bad. Then he sat back. There's a move Cross can make, he said. If he confirms you exist, if he confirms what you are to me, his play is a snatch. He takes you and he holds the situation. He knows I won't burn my own. He stopped, recalibrated. He knows I'll negotiate to protect you. That gives him a lever. He's wanted a lever for 3 years. So we're the lever, Calla said. You could be. Unless you act first. Yes. Calla looked at him steadily. What does acting first look like? Silas's jaw tightened slightly. My way. It looks like a message being sent, a specific kind of message, something Cross understands and his people understand, and the problem goes away at the source. The room was quiet. No, Calla said. Silas looked at her. That's not happening, she said. Not while we're in the same city. Not while we know about it. Not in our name, which is what it would be. She held his gaze without blinking. We're not leverage, and we're not justification. If you go that route, you do it alone and you lose. She paused, and something shifted in her voice, just barely, just 1 degree toward something younger and rawer. You lose whatever this is, whatever we just started. The silence after that was the loudest thing in the room. Marin watched Silas absorb it, watched him look at this child, his child, who had just told him no in the same tone you'd use to deny a very simple and reasonable request, and who had done it while holding open the door to something he hadn't known he wanted until about 18 hours ago. She watched something move across his face that she had very rarely seen in 2 years of knowing him: uncertainty. Then what do you suggest? He said, and it came out quieter than he'd intended. Calla looked at Knox. Knox closed his notebook. We have another option, he said, but you're not going to like it. The plan Knox laid out over the next 40 minutes was meticulous, structured, and revealed in its construction the specific kind of mind that had clearly been absorbing systems analysis since before it had language for what it was doing. Marin listened to her son and felt the specific vertigo of a parent watching their child exceed them in some fundamental way. The short version, Knox had identified a vulnerability in Cross's financial structure, a series of transactions moving through 3 shell companies that, taken together, constituted documentation of crimes that had nothing to do with Silas and everything to do with Cross acting outside the bounds of the organization's own internal code. The kind of thing that, if surfaced to the right people inside the organization, would generate consequences without requiring Silas to be the instrument of those consequences. It's a controlled exposure, Knox said. You surface the information through a channel Cross can't trace back to you. The organization handles Cross internally. You're not the actor, you're the catalyst. Silas stared at his son for a long moment. Who taught you to think like this? Knox considered the question. We read a lot, he said finally. Marin? Silas turned to her. Don't look at me, she said. I took them to the library. I didn't know they were doing graduate-level criminal strategy in the periodicals section. Something moved across Silas's face that almost became a smile. It didn't make it all the way, but it got closer than she'd expected. The plan has problems, he said, turning back to Knox. The channel you're describing, surfacing this internally, requires a contact I trust at a specific level. I don't know if that contact is still clean. Harlan Reese, Knox said. Silas went still. Deputy Operational Director, Knox continued. 14 years with your organization. Financial profile inconsistent with someone on Cross's payroll. And his daughter has a medical situation that Cross's people tried to use as a pressure point 8 months ago and failed, which means he's got personal reason to want Cross gone. He looked at Silas steadily. He's clean, and he's motivated. The stillness on Silas's face deepened. You've been inside my organization's personnel records, he said. Yes, Knox said. Silas stopped. That's a significant breach. We were careful. You were 10, he said, and this time there was something in his voice that wasn't anger. It was closer to a kind of staggered recognition, like a man watching a wall he'd thought was solid turn out to be a door. We're still 10, Calla said helpfully. Marin stood up. She needed to be vertical. She went to the window and looked out at the street. Ordinary Tuesday morning traffic, a dog walker, a woman pushing a stroller, and she felt the gap between that ordinary world and the conversation happening in her living room as a physical sensation, like standing on the wrong side of a pane of glass. This plan requires time, she said, without turning around. Surfacing the information, letting the internal process work. That's days, maybe a week, and Cross's timeline might not give us that. I can accelerate the internal process, Silas said. How? I have a meeting with the full operational committee on Friday. Standing agenda. If Reese has the information before then, the right question at the right moment surfaces it in the room. He paused. Cross will be there. He won't see it coming. And between now and Friday, Marin said, we're sitting here. No, Silas said. You're not. She turned from the window. I have a property, he said. Not connected to me publicly. Clean deed, clean utilities, nothing that runs through any of my known holdings. It's 40 minutes outside the city. He looked at her directly. It's safe. I need you there until Friday. The silence stretched. You want us to go to one of your safe houses, Marin said. Yes. Silas, do you understand how that sounds? It's not a negotiation, he said, and the familiar flatness was back in his voice, not harsh, just absolute. Cross's people are watching this street. They have been for 8 months. The calculation changed yesterday when my car spent 2 hours on this block last night. He paused. And I wasn't careful enough about that. I should have been. That's on me. His jaw was tight. I won't make that mistake twice. Marin looked at him. The admission, that's on me, was not something Silas Vane produced easily or often. She knew that from experience. She recognized its weight. If we go with you, she said, that's not the end of the conversation. Not by a long way. I know. You don't get to have them and not earn it. You don't get proximity as a right. I know, he said again, and his voice had changed again, gone quieter. And I'm not forgiving you, she said. Not today. Not because of a safe house. Not because of... She stopped herself. 6 years, Silas. 6 years of building something small and safe and real. And in one day, I know what it cost you, he said. No, she said. You don't. You found out you have children yesterday. I've been their mother every single day. Her voice didn't break, but it thickened in a way she hadn't authorized. You don't get to know what that cost in one conversation. The room was very quiet. Knox had closed his notebook. Calla was watching Marin with those gray eyes that saw too much, and Marin recognized in her daughter's face the specific expression of a child who is old enough to understand adult pain and young enough to not yet have the armor for it. 40 minutes outside the city, Marin said finally. We packed light. My car. My driver, Silas said. My car, she said again, and this time he didn't push back. They were packed within the hour. Marin moved through the apartment with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed emergency departure without ever wanting to need it. Documents first, then the children's essentials, then the specific items she'd learned over 6 years of careful living were the ones you'd regret leaving behind. She'd kept a go bag under the bathroom sink since the first year. She pulled it out and updated it in 11 minutes. The twins packed their own bags. Knox had his notebook, his laptop, 3 changes of clothes, and the folder, both copies, she noticed, from both their sessions with Silas. He packed them at the bottom, carefully. Calla packed clothes, her tablet, and a small wooden box that Marin had given her when she was 6. She didn't open it. She just put it in the bag. Silas stood in the hallway and did not offer to help and did not get in the way, which was the right call. She noted it. They were outside and in the car by 9:47. Dominic pulled a dark SUV to the curb half a block away as they came out, and Silas led them to it with the particular kind of unhurried efficiency that meant he was paying very close attention to everything around him. Marin scanned the street by habit. Parked cars, second-floor windows, a man with a coffee outside the corner place who might have been there 5 minutes or 40. She couldn't tell. She'd never been as good at this part as he was. They got in. Knox and Calla in the back middle seat. Marin and Silas behind Dominic, a seat of space between them. The car pulled out. For a few minutes, nobody said anything. Portland moved past the windows, the neighborhood giving way to arterials, the arterials feeding toward the bridge opening up to the gray width of the river below. Then Knox said, from the back seat, quietly but clearly, "Someone's following us." Dominic's eyes went to the rearview mirror. Silas turned to look through the rear window, and Marin watched his face shift into the specific configuration she remembered from 2 years of watching him process threats. Not panic, not alarm, just a cold, focused recalibration, like a temperature dropping. "Silver sedan," Knox said. 4 cars back. It picked us up 2 blocks from the apartment. It's maintaining distance but adjusting speed with us. "How long have you been watching?" Silas said. "Since we got in," Dominic said, without inflection. "Confirmed. I see it." Silas pulled out his phone. 2 taps. A connection. "Reese," he said when it picked up, "I need you to move the Friday agenda item to today. 2 hours." He listened. "I don't care what it disrupts. 2 hours." He hung up. Marin looked at him. "That's not the plan we discussed." "The plan assumed we had until Friday," he said. "We don't." He looked at the road ahead. Cross's people move faster than I expected, which means Cross knows more than he should. The contact inside your organization, Knox said. Yes. Then the exposure has to happen before your committee meeting, Knox said, not during it. Yes. That changes the sequence, Knox said. He had his notebook open in his lap, pen moving. If the internal exposure happens before the meeting rather than in the meeting, Cross gets warning. He has time to respond before the committee can act. Yes, Silas said. So the exposure can't be internal, Knox said. A pause. Knox, Marin said carefully, if you expose Cross's documentation externally, Knox said, still writing, Cross has no warning window. The internal structure reacts to outside pressure instead of inside information. The sequence is, he paused, looking at the page, faster, more volatile, but Cross has less room to maneuver. The car crossed the bridge. The silver sedan was still there. Silas looked at his son in the rearview mirror. Knox was writing in his notebook, calm, focused, working through the problem with the same steady attention he'd brought to everything since he walked into Silas's office yesterday morning. External exposure means going to a prosecutor, Silas said, or a journalist. Either way, it burns part of my operation along with Cross's. There's collateral. Some collateral, Knox said. Not all. The documentation we have is specific to Cross's independent operations. It doesn't touch your core structure if it's handled correctly. He looked up. We can handle it correctly. Marin was looking at her son, her 10-year-old son, in the back seat of a moving car with a tail 2 blocks behind them, restructuring the strategic response to a criminal power play in real time in a spiral notebook with a blue ballpoint pen. Marin. Silas's voice, quieter than usual. She looked at him. I need you to know something. She waited. I didn't know, he said, about any of this. I want to say that to you directly. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the road, the way he often looked away from things that cost him. I didn't know you were pregnant. I didn't know you were alive. If I had known... Don't, she said. Marin. Not in the car, she said. Not right now. Not with them listening. She said it quietly, but it was final. He stopped. In the back seat, Calla reached over and took Knox's pen out of his hand and wrote something in the margin of his notebook. Knox read it. Something shifted in his expression, softer, briefly, before the usual stillness came back. Marin didn't see what Calla wrote. She looked back at the road. The silver sedan was closer now, 3 cars back, and then 2. Dominic's eyes were steady in the mirror, hands relaxed on the wheel, in the specific way of someone managing a situation rather than reacting to. Dominic didn't wait for an order. He took the next exit hard, not squealing, not dramatic, just a decisive cut across 2 lanes that required the car behind them to brake and created a gap that he immediately used to run a yellow light turning red at the bottom of the ramp. The silver sedan made the exit but caught the red, and Dominic used those 12 seconds to take 3 consecutive turns in a pattern that had nothing to do with the direction they'd been heading. Nobody in the car spoke during this. Marin had her hand braced on the door. The twins were pressed back in their seats, not panicked. She checked them automatically, the way she always checked them, but alert, tracking, absorbing the situation with the same focused quiet they brought to everything. Knox had capped his pen. Calla was watching the rear window. After the 3rd turn, Dominic said, Lost them. For now, Silas said. For now, Dominic agreed. Silas was already on his phone. 2 calls in quick succession, both short, both conducted in the clipped shorthand of a man communicating with people who didn't need context. When he hung up the 2nd time, he turned to Marin. Change of destination. There's a location closer in commercial property, warehouse district. We can hold there while I sort the Cross situation. A warehouse, Marin said. It's clean and it's not in any system connected to me. Dom knows it. She looked at him, at the city moving past the windows, at the back of Dominic's head, then at the twins, who were both watching her, not scared, not asking, just waiting for her to decide because she was still the one who decided. That hadn't changed yet, regardless of what the last 24 hours had rearranged. Fine, she said. Eat. The warehouse was in the industrial corridor south of the rail yards. A flat, gray building with a loading dock and no signage, and the particular blankness of a place designed not to invite attention. Dominic pulled into the dock bay, cut the engine, and the door rolled down behind them before Marin had fully processed that they'd stopped moving. Inside, fluorescent work lights, a folding table, 4 chairs, a space heater that someone had turned on in advance. Clean concrete floor, no windows at ground level. The upper vents were covered. It smelled like rubber and climate-controlled nothing. The twins got out. Knox walked the perimeter immediately. One full circuit, checking corners, looking at the ceiling, cataloging exits. Marin watched him do it and recognized with a sickening clarity that he moved through unfamiliar spaces the way his father did. That it wasn't learned behavior because he'd never been around his father. It was something older than learning. Calla sat on the folding table, not in one of the chairs. The table gave her height and sightline advantage over the room. Marin recognized that too and said nothing. Silas was on his phone again, by the far wall, voice too low to catch. Dominic stood near the bay door with his arms at his sides in the restful stillness of a man comfortable with waiting. Marin stood in the middle of the floor and felt the size of the situation settle onto her, fully, for the first time since yesterday morning. Not the fear of it. She'd been managing fear for 6 years. She had infrastructure for that. But the weight of how completely her life had been disassembled in less than 24 hours. The apartment, the routine, the careful architecture of ordinary, gone, or as good as gone, because even if they went back, it would not be the same. Something had been opened that did not close. Her phone buzzed. Not the prepaid, her regular phone, the one with her actual number under her actual alias. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Different unknown than Silas's call last night. Different area code. She answered. Ms. Blythe. Not a question. A man's voice, older, measured, with the particular smoothness of someone who had spent decades making dangerous things sound reasonable. Or would you prefer I use your original name? I'm flexible on that point. She kept her voice flat. Who is this? My name is Leland Cross. I believe you've heard it recently. She did not look at Silas. She did not look at the twins. She kept her eyes on the middle distance and her voice at the same level. What do you want? A conversation, Cross said. A brief one. I have some information I'd like to share with you before you make decisions that are difficult to reverse. I'm not interested in a conversation with you. I understand that instinct, but the information concerns your children, Ms. Blythe, and I think you'll want to hear it before Silas does. A pause. Precisely calibrated, she could feel the calculation behind it. Because it changes what you think you know about why you had to run in the first place. The concrete floor seemed to shift slightly under her. I'm listening, she said. Ansen. Cross talked for 4 minutes. He was precise, unhurried, and he provided specific details, dates, names, document numbers, of the kind that can't be fabricated on short notice because they're too granular, too cross-referenced, too embedded in the texture of real events to be manufactured in real time. What he told her was this. 6 years ago, the order to surveil Marin Blythe had not originated with a rival faction. It had not come from outside Silas's organization. It had come from inside it. Specifically, from Silas's then second-in-command, a man named Gareth Lyle, who had identified Marin as a liability, a civilian with too much knowledge, too much access, and a pregnancy that would create complications. Gareth had brought the assessment to Silas. And Silas, Cross said quietly, had not said no. He had said, handle it cleanly. The phone call ended. Marin stood in the warehouse with the phone in her hand and the 4 minutes of information rearranging everything she'd understood about her own history. She stood very still. Her breathing was steady because it had to be. Because the alternative was to come apart in a concrete room with her children watching, and that was not going to happen. She turned. Silas was still at the far wall. He'd finished his call. He was watching her with the expression he got when he'd already assessed a situation and was waiting to see how it developed. Controlled, patient, already a move ahead. She walked toward him. She stopped 3 feet away and looked at his face and tried to find, in the landscape of it, something that told her Cross was lying, something that broke the story, some inconsistency. Gareth Lyle, she said. Something happened in Silas's eyes. Just briefly. Just enough. Where did you hear that name? He said, very quiet. Cross just called me, she said, on my real phone. The number I haven't used in front of you. She watched his jaw tighten. He told me Gareth brought you an assessment 6 years ago. He told me what the assessment said. She kept her voice level. She was proud of that, distantly, the way you're proud of something that costs you. He told me what you said back. The warehouse was very quiet. Dominic, across the room, had gone completely still. The twins. She didn't look at the twins. She couldn't look at them right now and hold this together at the same time. It wasn't in order, Silas said. His voice was wrong. Not defensive. Silas didn't do defensive. It wasn't in his register. But compressed, stripped down to something almost unrecognizable in its absence of control. What I said to Gareth was not in order. Then what was it? It was... He stopped, jaw working. I told him to manage the situation. I didn't specify... You told him to handle it cleanly, Marin said. Those are your words, Silas, your specific language. Handle it cleanly is not an ambiguous instruction inside your organization. Every person who works for you knows exactly what that means. I didn't know you were pregnant, he said. That's not an answer. Marin, did you tell Gareth Lyle to handle the situation? Her voice cracked on the last 2 words. She pulled it back immediately, mortared the crack over, kept going. Yes or no? The silence lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4, long enough that she had her answer before he gave it. Yes, he said. The word fell into the space between them like something with mass. She took a step back, not because she was afraid of him. She was past fear right now, operating in a register that sat somewhere on the other side of fear, something colder and more final. She stepped back because proximity to him felt suddenly, physically wrong, like standing too close to a fire that had already burned her once. Mom, Calla's voice from behind her, low, careful. Marin held up one hand, not harshly, just not yet. And Calla went quiet, because even now, even in this, Calla understood. You told a man in your organization to eliminate me, Marin said, and then I disappeared before he could, and you... She stopped, breathed. You received a report afterward, a body, dental confirmation, and you accepted it. You closed the door. Yes, Silas said, still that compressed, stripped voice. Were you relieved, she said, when you got the report? Were you relieved that it was handled? This time the silence was longer. I don't know, he said, and it was the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say, and it was the worst possible answer he could have given her. She turned away from him. She walked to the far end of the warehouse, past the folding table, past the space heater, to the bare concrete wall. She put one hand against it and stood there and breathed. In, out, in. Behind her she heard Calla say to Silas, very quietly and very distinctly, You should stop talking now. What? 20 minutes later, Silas's phone rang. He'd been standing against the wall on his side of the warehouse. He'd made no move toward Marin, no attempt at further explanation. Marin hadn't turned around. The twins had migrated to her side of the room. Not dramatically, just gradually, the way water finds its level. He answered, listened for 40 seconds. His face, already closed, went several degrees more closed. Say that again, he said. He listened. He hung up. Reese, he said. His voice was back to its usual flatness, which was how she knew the information was bad. When things got bad enough, Silas went smooth the way a sea goes smooth before a serious storm. He's been picked up. 2 of Cross's people outside his building 30 minutes ago. Knox looked up from his notebook. The exposure plan. Compromised, Silas said. If Cross has Reese, he has our timeline. He knows we were going to surface the documentation through Reese, which means he knows the documentation exists, Knox said. Yes. So he's going to move to contain it, Knox said. Not through Reese anymore. Through us. He looked at Silas steadily. He's going to come here. Not here, Silas said. He doesn't have this location, but he'll move on what he does have. He paused. He has the apartment address, and he has... His jaw tightened. He'll use Reese to get whatever he can in the next few hours. Reese knows the safe house property 40 minutes out. That's burned. He has Mom's phone number, Calla said. Yes. He called it to destabilize the room, Calla said. Not because he wanted a conversation. He wanted to create a fracture before he moved. He calculated that the information about Gareth would do the most damage fastest. She looked at Silas with those gray eyes that didn't carry judgment right now, just analysis. It worked. Silas said nothing. Marin had turned around. She was leaning against the far wall with her arms crossed, and her face doing the thing it did when she was making calculations. Still, slightly unfocused, working through something interior. She looked at Silas across the length of the warehouse. The distance between them felt measurable. He called my real phone, she said. Not the prepaid. How did he have that number? The question sat in the air. Silas looked at her, and she watched him work through it. Watched the sequence of deduction move across his contained expression, arrive at a conclusion, and then produce something that looked like it cost him physically. A tightening across the shoulders. A single, slow breath. Gareth, he said. Gareth Lyle. He left the organization 14 months ago. I thought... He stopped. I thought he was out. Retired. He had enough to live on and no reason to... Another stop. He took files when he left. I knew he took files. I let it go because I thought the risk was managed, Marin said, and she put a very specific edge on the word. You thought the risk was managed. Yes. The way you managed me. The silence that followed that was the longest yet. Knox closed his notebook. He looked at his father with the dark, still eyes that had been assessing everything since they walked into the Vane building yesterday. And he said, We need to move past the last 5 minutes. Not because it doesn't matter. It does. But because Cross is building a timeline and we're standing still. It was such a precise adult thing to say, delivered in a 10-year-old's voice, that it cut through the room like a blade. Even Marin unfolded her arms. He's right, Calla said. She looked at Marin first, then Silas. You two don't get to do this right now. Do it later. We need the next hour. Marin looked at her daughter, looked at her son, looked at the situation. She pushed off the wall. What do we know about Cross's current position? She said. Not to Silas, to Knox. Knox opened his notebook back up. He's operating from a secondary base, not his registered business address, which is downtown. Based on the surveillance pattern over the past 8 months, his actual operational center is in the North Industrial Corridor. We have a probable address. He turned the notebook around. It's 7 minutes from here. Silas looked at the address. How do you have that? We've been building the file for 6 months, Knox said. We didn't just build it on you. A beat. You built files on everyone, Silas said. We built files on everyone relevant, Calla said. Cross. 3 of his people, Gareth Lyle, and 2 others you should probably know about. She reached into her bag and produced a folded sheet. She'd been carrying it this whole time, Marin realized, carrying it since they left the apartment, and set it on the folding table. Those 2 are inside your organization, not Cross's people originally, yours. But they flipped in the last 6 months. We don't know their motive yet, but the behavioral pattern in the financial data is clear. Silas picked up the sheet. He read the 2 names. Something happened to his face that Marin had never seen before in 2 years of knowing him and 24 hours of this. It was not anger. She knew his anger. It was cold and controlled and expressed itself in stillness. This was different. This was the expression of a man who has been holding a structure together with his hands for years and just looked down and found that 2 of the load-bearing pieces were gone. It was something very close to grief. Lena Marsh, he said. The name came out flat. Yes, Calla said. She's been with me for 9 years. 8 months ago, something changed, Knox said, not unkindly. We don't know what, but the data is... It's not ambiguous. Silas set the sheet down. He stood at the table with both hands on it, head slightly forward, and he was very still, and the stillness had a different quality than his usual stillness. Less controlled, more like the stillness of something load-bearing that has just been told the ground beneath it has shifted. Marin watched him. She was still angry. The anger had not gone anywhere. It was sitting in her chest like something with teeth, and it would still be there in an hour and tomorrow, and for a long time after that. She knew that. She wasn't managing the anger, she was just bracketing it, the way Calla had said, because the next hour required something more functional than rage. Cross is going to send people, she said. He's destabilized your trusted contact, he's moved your internal informants against you, and he's broken the information open between you and me. His next step is physical. She looked at Silas. What resources do you have right now that you're certain about? He lifted his head. His face had gone smooth again. The storm glass. Dominic. 2 others I can reach who aren't in the system Cross can access. He paused. And the documentation your children put together. The documentation can't help us in the next hour, Marin said. No, he said, but it can help us in the next 24. If we survive the next hour, Calla said. Yes, Silas said. If we survive that. The warehouse hummed with the sound of the space heater working against the November concrete. Marin looked at her children, at their careful, prepared, extraordinary faces, and she thought about the 6 years she'd spent building walls between them and this world. The walls were gone. She'd known that since last night, but she felt it now as a fact in her body, physical and irreversible. They were in it. All of them. The question was what kind of people they were going to be inside it. Dominic's voice came from near the bay door. Quiet, no inflection, the particular calm of someone trained to deliver bad news without adding to the damage. We've got a vehicle outside, parked at the far end of the block. It wasn't there when we pulled in. Nobody moved for exactly 1 second. Then Knox picked up his pen and opened his notebook to a fresh page, and at the top of it he wrote an address, the one he'd shown Silas, Cross's probable operational base, and drew 3 arrows beneath it indicating 3 separate approaches to the building, with notation alongside each one. He turned the notebook around on the table so everyone could see. We're not waiting for them to come in, Knox said. His voice was 10 years old and completely, terrifyingly steady. We know where Cross is. We know what he has and what he doesn't. We know this location is compromised. He looked at his father. The only move that changes the shape of this is the one Cross isn't expecting. Silas looked at his son. Marin looked at hers. We go to him, Calla said. And before Silas could answer, before Marin could answer, the bay door at the far end of the warehouse rang with a single flat impact, the unmistakable sound of something heavy and deliberate striking metal from the outside, and Dominic stepped back from it with his hand already moving toward. Dominic's hand cleared his jacket in the same motion he used to step back from the door. Silas was already moving, not toward the door, toward the twins. Marin registered this in the half-second before her own body caught up with the situation. He moved toward the children first, not toward the threat, not toward a position of tactical advantage, toward Calla and Knox. She filed that away somewhere and didn't examine it. Back wall, Silas said. Low, flat, no room in it for discussion. All 3 of you, now. Marin moved. The twins moved with her, Knox closing his notebook and tucking it under his arm in the same motion, Calla already scanning the space with those gray eyes, finding the geometry of the room at speed. The back wall was concrete block, no windows. The most defensible position in the warehouse, if defensible meant anything in a space this size with one trained man and whatever was outside that door. The bay door rang again, harder this time. Then a voice from outside, muffled but directional, coming from the left side of the doorframe rather than the center, which meant at least 2 people out there. One making noise, one positioned off-axis. Dominic looked at Silas. Silas looked at the door, at the ceiling, at the upper vent covers he'd noted when they came in. His jaw was working slightly, the way it did when he was running options at speed. Marin had watched him do this in boardrooms, and she'd watched him do it at 2 in the morning with bad news on a phone, and the quality of it was always the same. No panic, just this cold, fast interior machinery grinding through possibilities and eliminating them one by one. The vent access on the east side bit, he said to Dominic very quietly. Is it 2-way? Dominic considered this for exactly 1 second. If I go out, I can't get back in the same way. Different angles. Go, Silas said. Dominic was across the warehouse floor in 8 strides, silent on the concrete, and he was up the wall-mounted utility ladder beside the east vent in 4 seconds with a fluency that said he'd trained for spaces like this. The vent cover came off without significant noise. He was through it and gone. The bay door took a 3rd impact. Something different in the sound this time. Metal fatigue, the door flexing. They had something mechanical outside. They weren't going to announce themselves much longer. Silas turned to Marin. 3 feet of space between them. The same 3 feet that had held a detonated history 20 minutes ago. And none of that had changed. None of it had been resolved, but it existed right now in a different category of priority. The documentation, he said. Knox, where is it? Knox patted the bag on his shoulder. With me. Both copies. Digitally backed to a server we control. The server, off-site, encrypted, and the access key is in Kala's head, not written anywhere. Knox met his eyes. We planned for scenarios where the physical copies were compromised. Something moved through Silas's expression. Not the time for it. He turned back to the door. When that comes open, he said, to nobody specifically, and therefore to all of them, there are going to be at least 3 people, maybe more. They're not here to negotiate, and they're not here to collect. Cross already tried the soft approach, and it didn't land. This is containment. He paused. They'll want the documentation, and they'll want to eliminate the... He stopped, recalibrated the sentence. They'll want to remove the problem. Us, Kala said. Yes. You're 3 feet from the problem, she said. For the record. I know, Silas said. The bay door gave its first real scream of metal, the locking mechanism failing under whatever they were using outside, the whole frame shuddering in a way that sent vibration through the concrete floor and up through the soles of Marin's feet. Silas did something she didn't expect. He turned to face them, all 3 of them, back against the wall. And he looked at the twins for 1 full second with a directness he hadn't allowed himself since the living room. Then he looked at Marin. His face was stripped of everything that wasn't functional, and what was left underneath was not the cold architecture of the man she'd spent 6 years running from. It was something she didn't have immediate language for. Stay behind me, he said. Whatever happens, both of you. To the twins. Then to Marin. If there's a gap, any gap, you take them and you run. Don't wait. Don't look back. Silas, don't argue with me on this one, he said. Quiet. Final. The door came open. It didn't explode inward the way doors did in movies. It sheared, the lock mechanism tearing free on the left side, the door swinging hard and fast and slamming the interior wall with a report like a gunshot. And the cold November air poured into the warehouse along with 3 men moving through the gap in the practiced overlapping pattern of people who'd done building entries before. Marin had the twins behind her before the door finished swinging, an instinct older than thought, just her body placing itself between her children and the threat. She felt Knox's hand close on the back of her jacket, and she let him hold it. Silas was in the center of the floor. He'd picked up the only thing in the warehouse that constituted a useful object, a length of steel conduit 3 feet long that had been leaning against the utility ladder. It was not a gun. It was not remotely equivalent to what the 3 men coming through the door were carrying, which was considerably more sophisticated. But he held it with the specific comfort of someone who understood that the goal was not to match hardware, but to manage distance and timing and the psychology of a room. The first man through stopped when he saw Silas standing there. The second and third fanned to either side, the way they'd been trained to, and the space between them covered the whole width of the warehouse floor. The first man, mid-40s, thick through the shoulders, a scar along his chin that hadn't healed cleanly, looked past Silas to the back wall, to Marin and the twins. Step aside, Vane, he said. Not aggressive, businesslike. No, Silas said. The man looked at him, assessed. You're holding a pipe. I know what I'm holding. I know what you've got, Silas said. I'm also aware that Cross needs the documentation intact, which means you're not in a position to do anything indiscriminate. You need them. He didn't turn or gesture, but the pronoun was clear. Accessible and cooperative, which means you can't damage them in ways that affect their functioning. That's a significant constraint on your options. His voice was completely level. Mine are considerably less constrained. The man on the right shifted his weight. Silas tracked it. Marin could see him track it, a small movement of his eyes. And he angled himself slightly to keep both flanking men in his peripheral field. There are 3 of us, the first man said. There are, Silas said. A half second of nothing. Then Silas moved, and he moved with a speed that was jarring from a man who had been standing completely still, closing the distance to the first man in 3 strides, and the conduit coming up not in an arc, but in a direct horizontal strike at the man's forearm. Specifically, his forearm, specifically the gun hand, the kind of targeting that came from knowing where to hit to produce the most immediate functional disruption. The gun went sideways. Not dropped, the man's grip held, but the wrist was compromised and the aim was gone. And in the half-second that created, Silas was already rotating, using the first man's body as a buffer between himself and the right-side flanker. And the conduit came back in a short, vicious arc. The first man went down on one knee. The right-side flanker had his angle and took it, and Silas took the hit. Marin saw it, saw the impact across his left shoulder and the way his whole left side dropped from it. But he didn't go down. He used the force of it to turn and close distance to the flanker, too close for the gun to be useful, and for a moment the two of them were locked together in the ugly, grinding close quarters work that looked nothing like choreography and everything like two people trying to damage each other with whatever they had. The left side flanker was moving toward the back wall, toward Marin and the twins. Marin didn't wait. She'd spent 6 years being careful, being small, constructing safety out of invisibility and routine, and the specific discipline of never being the kind of person who attracted attention. She had not spent those 6 years being passive. You could not raise 2 children who moved through dangerous spaces with the confidence Calla and Knox carried without having some understanding of how dangerous spaces worked. She'd learned things, quietly, in the years after she ran, things that didn't make her a fighter but made her functional in the fraction of a second that mattered. She stepped away from the wall to meet him rather than letting him come to her, which surprised him. People against walls didn't step forward. The geometry was wrong. And in the half-step of surprise, she drove the heel of her hand into his nose with the full weight of her body behind it. Not perfectly, not cleanly. His head snapped back and blood came immediately, and he didn't go down, but he stopped, both hands going to his face by pure reflex. And that reflex was the gap. Knox moved around her left side. He didn't hit the man. He went for the man's jacket pocket. Specific, targeted, the move of someone who'd identified the objective in advance and wasn't interested in anything else. He pulled something free. A phone. He was back behind Marin before the man's hands came down from his face. "Got it," Knox said. Marin looked at her son. "What?" "Cross's contact number," Knox said. He was already opening the phone with hands that were not entirely steady, but steady enough. "This man is Cross's direct line. If we have this phone, we can reach Cross directly without going through an intermediary." He looked up. "We can talk to him before this gets worse." The man in front of them had his nose bleeding freely and was looking at Knox with an expression that was somewhere between professional assessment and something more personal. Marin held his gaze and did not move out of the space between him and her son. "Don't," she said to the man. "Simple. Direct." He looked at her for a moment, then he stepped back. Not surrender. Calculation. Waiting for the room to resolve. The room resolved in another 40 seconds. Dominic came through the east vent from the outside and came down the utility ladder at the same moment the second flanker finally got Silas off him and went for distance. And Dominic closed that distance from behind with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this geometry. The second flanker went down and stayed there. The first man was on both knees, right wrist held against his chest, still functional but not moving. The left side flanker, bleeding, stood where Marin had left him. Silas was standing in the middle of the floor. He was breathing hard. She could see it, the controlled effort of a man managing pain and keeping it out of his face. His left shoulder was wrong. Not broken, she thought, but wrong, held slightly lower than the right, moving with the careful deliberateness of something that hurt badly enough to require active management. He looked at Marin. She looked at him. "You hit someone," he said. "Yes." A pause. "Are you all right?" "Are you?" she said. His jaw tightened slightly. "Fine." "You're not fine. Your shoulder." "It's fine," he said, and the flatness of it was so reflexively, specifically male, that under any other circumstances she might have said something sharp about it. This was not those circumstances. Knox stepped forward, Cross's man's phone in his hand. "We need to use this now," he said. "Before Cross sends more people, and before he has time to interpret the silence as a failure." Silas looked at the phone. "What's the play?" Cross wanted the documentation and to neutralize us, Knox said. He doesn't have either. He doesn't know what his team got or didn't get. If we call him directly from his own man's phone, the first thing that does is tell him the room went wrong. The second thing is it puts us in control of the narrative before he can build one from silence. Knox looked at his father. You talk to him, but I want to be on speaker. Silas looked at his 10-year-old son for a long moment. Okay, he said. Cross answered on the second ring. He heard the ambient sound of the warehouse, heard nothing that told him what had happened, and said, Report. Silas said, It's Vane. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Marin watched Silas's face and thought about what Cross was doing in those seconds, recalculating every variable in real time, the way capable people did when confronted with information that broke their model. She knew that process. She'd lived inside it herself, twice in the last 24 hours. Vane, Cross said. His voice had not changed. Points to him, too. I assume Marcus and his team are not available to come to the phone. They're available, Silas said. They're just sitting down. A pause. What do you want? The same thing I wanted at 9 o'clock this morning before you decided to accelerate the timeline, Silas said. An end to this. The documentation exists in 3 locations, 2 of which you cannot reach and 1 of which you cannot identify, Silas said. Destroying this copy, he looked at Knox's bag, changes nothing. You know that. The documentation is damaging to both of us, Cross said. More to you, Silas said. Significantly more. What I have on you is independent of what you have on me. Your exposure is cleaner and more direct. He paused. And you know I know that. You've known it for 6 months, which is why you've been waiting. You needed the leverage first. You needed something I'd move to protect. Your children, Cross said. The word landed in the warehouse like a stone into water. Yes, Silas said. His voice did not change. But Marin watched something happen in the set of his shoulders. Not a flinch, just a deepening of the tension that was already there from the injury, a physical manifestation of the word hitting somewhere it was not allowed to show. They walked into my office yesterday morning, which you know because Gareth called you within the hour. He stopped. Where is Gareth now? A pause. Retired. Leland. A longer pause. He's been dealt with, Cross said, and the phrasing was precise in a way that closed a door. Marin looked at Silas. His face told her nothing, but the fact that it was telling her nothing told her he'd expected this. Calla spoke from beside Marin's left arm. She'd come forward at some point without Marin registering it, because she moved the way her father moved, without announcing herself. Mr. Cross, she said. Silence on the line. Mr. Cross? Calla said again. My name is Calla. I'm one of the children you've been watching for 8 months. A very long silence. The documentation we compiled, Calla said, covers your independent operations over the last 4 years. Not the operations you run under the organization's umbrella. The ones you've been running parallel. The trafficking contracts out of the northern ports. The blackmail infrastructure in the financial sector. The 3 accounts that don't appear in any record you've shared with the organization's financial oversight. She paused, letting each item land. We can go further if you need us to. We have further. Another pause, shorter. You wanted leverage. You've been building toward it for a long time. I understand the logic. Her voice was 10 years old and completely without tremor. But leverage only works if both sides have something to lose. And right now, between what we've built and what you've done to get here, you have considerably more to lose than we do. The warehouse was so quiet that Marin could hear the space heater's element ticking. Who taught you to speak like that? Cross said. His voice had changed. Not much, just a degree. The smoothness slightly less smooth. Nobody, Calla said. We read. Another silence. Then, what do you want? Silas looked at Calla. Calla looked at the phone. Reese, she said, released, unharmed, in the next 30 minutes. Your team withdraws from every location connected to us, and you sit on your hands while my father's organization processes the information about your independent operations through their internal structure. She paused. You don't get to walk away clean, but you get to walk away, which is more than you've earned. The silence from Cross's end stretched. Marin watched Silas watch his daughter, and she thought, he's never going to recover from this, from who they are. And she didn't know yet if that was good or devastating or both. I'll need confirmation, Cross said. That the documentation. You'll get Reese first, Calla said. Then we discuss confirmation. That's the sequence. It's not negotiable. A pause. 40 minutes, Cross said. 30, Calla said. The line went silent for a moment that felt much longer than it was. 30, Cross said, and the line went dead. The warehouse exhaled. Marin became aware that she'd been holding tension in her chest and shoulders for so long that releasing it was almost painful. A full-body unclenching that came through in one slow exhale. Knox sat down on the concrete floor cross-legged and opened his notebook and started writing, because of course he did. Dominic had one of Cross's men zip-tied with what appeared to be an electrical cable he'd found near the utility ladder. Silas was looking at Calla. Calla looked back at him. You knew the independent operations list by memory, he said. Yes, she said. How long have you been building that? 4 months, she said. Knox found the financial threads first. It took me another month to trace the physical operations from the money. She paused. It's very bad what he does. The trafficking contracts especially. Her voice didn't break, but it went to a different register for a moment. Less adult, briefly, the 10-year-old visible beneath the architecture. We didn't know how to feel about the fact that learning how to read it made us able to do that to him just now. Silas was quiet for a moment. How do you feel about it? Necessary, Calla said. And a little bit terrible. She looked at him steadily. Is that how it always feels? The question hung there. Silas crouched down to her eye level. With his bad shoulder, this was clearly costly, a brief tightening across his face, and he looked at his daughter from 3 feet away. When it goes right, when it's the right call for the right reason. He paused. Yes. It still feels like that. Both things at once. He held her gaze. If it ever stops feeling terrible, that's when you stop. Calla considered this. Then she nodded once, the specific nod of someone filing information they intend to keep. Marin watched this exchange from 2 feet away and felt the ground shift under her in a different way than the ground had been shifting all day. Not destabilizing, just moving, the way tectonic things move. Slow, irreversible. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A number she didn't know. She answered. Ms. Blythe? A woman's voice, clipped, professional. My name is Lena Marsh. I worked for Silas Vane. A pause. I need you to know something before the next hour resolves. Something about why I gave Cross the information I gave him. Her voice dropped. It wasn't for Cross. It was never for Cross. There's a piece of this you're missing, and if Silas moves on the information your children surfaced without knowing this piece, the whole thing lands wrong. Marin looked at Silas. He was watching her face. She put the phone on speaker because that was the decision they were in now. All of them, in the same room, with the same information, for better or worse. Talk, Marin said. And Lena Marsh talked, and what she said in the next 4 minutes restructured the entire architecture of what they thought they understood. And in the warehouse, with November cold bleeding under the damaged bay door, and Cross's men on the concrete floor, and Knox writing in his notebook, and Calla watching her father's face for his reaction. Silas Vane sat down on the edge of the folding table and put his face in his hands for 3 seconds, just 3, before he lifted it again and looked at the phone and said, How long have you been trying to get this information to me? 8 months, Lena said. Since the night Cross's people came to my daughter's hospital room and told me what they needed and what would happen to her if I didn't provide it. A pause. I've been feeding him enough to keep her safe and routing every piece I could back to a record you could eventually find. Her voice was very careful, very controlled, the voice of someone who had been operating under unbearable pressure for a very long time and had not yet decided it was safe to put it down. The documentation your children have, the holes in the financial data, the patterns that don't quite close, I left those deliberately. I needed someone to find them. She paused. I didn't expect it to be a 10-year-old. The silence after that was different from all the other silences in this very long day. Knox had stopped writing. He was looking at the phone with an expression Marin had never seen on his face before. Not the usual stillness, but something younger than that. A 10-year-old confronting the human cost of a system he'd been treating as an intellectual problem, and the confrontation showing on his face because he didn't have the armor for it yet. Calla reached over and put her hand on his arm. Didn't say anything, just put her hand there. Silas stood up from the table. He looked at the phone. He looked at Marin. "We need Lena in the room," he said. "She's 20 minutes out," Marin said, looking at the number. "If she's been running this for 8 months, she knows what safe approach looks like." She looked at him. "She gets a safe approach. Whatever else happens." Silas looked at her for a moment. Something in his face that she had no clean name for, moving behind his eyes. Then, "Yes, she gets a safe approach. And her daughter." "And her daughter," he said. "Absolutely, and her daughter." Marin looked at him. The man who had told someone to handle it cleanly 6 years ago, and the man who had put himself between armed people and her children 20 minutes ago, and the man who was crouching at eye level with his daughter in the middle of all of it, asking her how it feels to do necessary terrible things. She did not forgive him. She was not close to forgiving him. But she was looking at him in a way that was different from the way she'd been looking at him an hour ago, and the difference had to do with a complexity she wasn't ready to name. 20 minutes, she said. He nodded. Outside, the November sky was darkening toward late afternoon, and somewhere across the city the tower that bore his name stood lit against the gray. And in 30 minutes, Reese would walk out of wherever Cross was holding him. And in 20, Lena Marsh would walk through a warehouse door with 8 months of concealed evidence and a story that changed the shape of everything. And the children who had started all of this by walking calmly into the most dangerous office in Portland were sitting together on the cold concrete floor, one of them writing and one of them watching, and both of them waiting for the adults in the room to figure out what came. Lena Marsh came through the warehouse door at 4:52 in the afternoon. She was smaller than Marin had expected, compact, mid-40s, with the particular posture of someone who had been carrying weight for a long time and had learned to distribute it invisibly across their whole body so no single point showed the strain. Her hair was pulled back. Her coat was dark and practical. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder, and she walked in the way people walk when they've been afraid for a very long time and have learned to move through fear rather than around it. She stopped just inside the door. She looked at Silas. He looked at her. 8 months of her feeding Cross just enough to keep her daughter alive. 8 months of routing evidence back through channels she'd built from scratch, alone, with no confirmation that anyone was receiving it or following the trail. 8 months of being a traitor to his face and a loyalist in the architecture of everything she'd quietly constructed behind it. "Lena," he said. "I know," she said. "I know what it looks like." "It looks like you saved the documentation that's going to end Cross's operation," he said, "and kept it alive long enough for someone to find it." He paused. "It also looks like you gave him enough real information that 3 of my operational contacts are compromised, and we spent the morning in a warehouse getting doors knocked in." "Yes," she said. "Both of those are true." "Your daughter," he said. Her face moved, just briefly, the specific movement of a parent's face when their child is named in a context that carries threat. "She's 14. She had a procedure in September. Cross's people were in her room the night before it." Lena's voice was completely controlled, and the control was the most visible thing about her. "They didn't touch her. They just were there. When I came in the next morning..." She stopped. "I understood the message." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Is she all right?" "The procedure went well," Lena said. "She's home. She doesn't know any of this. She's not going to," Silas said. "That's done. Cross's people don't have access to her anymore. That's the first thing that's done." He said it with the flat finality of someone closing a door that was going to stay closed, and Marin watched Lena absorb it, watched the specific way a person's body changes when a weight they've been carrying alone is taken from them, not gone, but shared, the load redistributing. Lena's shoulders dropped approximately half an inch. "The information I routed back," Lena said. She reached into her canvas bag and produced a thin drive. "It's all here, complete record. What I gave Cross, what I kept back, the access log showing the routing pattern." She held it out. "You'll be able to verify every decision I made." Silas looked at the drive, then at her. He took it. Sit down, he said. We have work to do. Tuan. The work took 3 hours. Reese arrived at the warehouse at 5:20, thin, disheveled, a bruise developing along his left jaw, but functional and furious in the specific way of a man who has been held against his will and is processing the indignity of it while simultaneously preparing to be useful. He embraced Silas's shoulder briefly, the clipped physical acknowledgement of men who don't do warmth easily but mean it when they do. And then he sat at the folding table with Lena's drive and Knox's documentation and got to work. Dominic managed the perimeter. Cross's 3 men remained zip-tied and cooperative, which was the cooperation of people who understood the room they were in. Silas worked the phones, carefully, selectively, calling the members of his organizational committee he was certain about. Not all of them. 4 out of 11. Enough. The conversation with each one was short and specific, and by the end of the second call, the internal structure had begun to move in the direction Knox had originally mapped, accelerated now by the warehouse confrontation making the urgency undeniable. Marin watched all of this from the back wall, where she'd returned. Not because she was excluded from it, nobody had excluded her, but because she needed the wall at her back while she thought, and the thinking required some distance from the machinery of it. The twins were at this table with Reese. Knox was cross-referencing his documentation against Lena's drive with the focused intensity of a researcher who has just been given access to a primary source. Calla was asking Reese questions, careful, specific questions, about the organizational structure at the level just below the executive committee, the level where the 2 flipped contacts operated. Reese was answering them with the slight dazed quality of a man who kept expecting to be talking to an adult and kept finding a 10-year-old looking back at him. At some point, Marin became aware that Silas had finished his calls and was standing beside her. She didn't look at him. She looked at the table, at her children working. Cross's people are withdrawing, he said quietly. The 4 contacts I reached, they're moving on Cross's independent operation through the internal channel. It'll be complete by morning. He paused. He'll face the organizational consequences before he has time to mount anything else. And the 2 inside your organization, she said. The ones who flipped. Removed from access an hour ago. Reese handled it remotely. He paused. They'll be given the option to cooperate with the internal review. If they cooperate, they're out, but they're safe. If they don't, he stopped. The organization makes that determination. Not me. She looked at him then. Is that different from how it would have worked before? He considered the question. Yes, he said. Somewhat. Somewhat. More than somewhat, he said, and the correction was small, but it was there and it was honest. They stood against the wall for a moment. The table's activity continued. Reese's typing, Knox's pen, Calla's voice asking about something she'd found in the routing records. Gareth Lyle, Marin said. Silas's jaw tightened. Cross said he was dealt with. I heard him. I believe that's true, Silas said, which means the man who carried the original order is gone. He paused. I know that doesn't close anything for you. The order still existed. I still gave it. Yes, she said. I'm not going to build a case for myself, he said. I know what I said to him. I know what it meant inside the organization. He stopped. Something moved across his face. The specific expression of a man forcing himself to finish an honest sentence he'd started. I've been sitting with what that means since you said it to me this afternoon. I'm going to be sitting with it for a long time. Marin looked at the side of his face, at the jaw, the temple, the silver starting at his hairline. The shoulder still held carefully low. You should have that looked at, she said. It's fine. It's not fine. You've been holding it the same way for 3 hours. A pause. After, he said. After, she agreed. It was the smallest possible truce. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't resolution, and it wasn't anything like okay. But it was 2 people agreeing to keep moving in the same direction for the next few hours, which was what the next few hours required. Cross made his last move at 7:30 that evening. Not a physical move. He'd lost the appetite for that after the warehouse. It came through a lawyer, of all things. An emergency communication through a legal intermediary citing potential exposure of Silas's core operations to a federal contact Cross maintained. A final leverage attempt. The kind of move a man makes when he's watching his options close and needs to believe he still has one. Reese read the communication, Then he handed it to Knox. Knox read it. He handed it to Calla. Calla read it, set it down, and looked at Silas. He's citing the port operations from 2019 through 2021, she said. The federal contact he's referencing. She looked at Reese. Is that contact still active? Reese looked startled. Is he still active? Calla said. No, Reese said. Retired 18 months ago. Calla nodded and looked at Silas. His leverage is citing a dead contact in operations that have been restructured since 2022. Either he knows this and he's bluffing, or he doesn't know and his information is 18 months stale. She set the paper flat on the table. Either way, it's not a threat. It's a goodbye. Silas looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he looked at Reese. Draft a response through the same legal channel. Acknowledge receipt, nothing else. That's it? Reese said. That's it, Silas said. He knows what it means. Reese drafted the response. It went at 7:47. At 8:03, Lena's phone buzzed. She looked at it, looked at Silas. My daughter's building security just confirmed 2 vehicles that have been parked on her street for 3 days have left. She held the phone and did not do anything dramatic with her face, but her eyes changed in a way that didn't require dramatics to communicate what it meant. They're gone. The room went quiet with something that wasn't exactly relief, but was adjacent to it. The specific quiet of people who have been operating in a state of sustained threat and feel the threat recede and don't trust it yet, but allow themselves cautiously to breathe at a different depth. Knox closed his notebook. He sat at the table and looked at it, the closed notebook, the completed record of the last 36 hours, and he sat with it for a moment with an expression that Marin recognized as the particular expression of someone who has just arrived at the other side of a very long effort and doesn't know yet what the arrival feels like. She went to him, she put her hand on his shoulder and felt him exhale under it. One long, slow release, the breath of a 10-year-old boy who had been holding himself at adult capacity for a day and a half and was now, incrementally, being allowed to put it down. You did good, she said quietly. Just to him. He looked up at her, his dark eyes, his father's eyes. Is it over? She looked around the warehouse. Reese working, Dominic at the door, Lena holding her phone, Silas standing at the edge of the table watching his children with an expression he was no longer working to contain. The worst part, she said. Yeah, I think so. Knox nodded. He put his pen in his jacket pocket. He leaned into her hand just slightly, the way he hadn't done in a long time. He'd been growing out of it, the easy physical comfort of young children, moving into the more complicated territory of almost adolescence, where contact required more negotiation. But he leaned in now, just for a moment, and she held it. Across the table, Calla was looking at Silas. Your shoulder, she said. Mom's right. You need to get it looked at. Silas looked at her. Your mother said after. It's after, Calla said. He almost smiled. She watched him not quite do it and recognized the specific restraint of a man who smiled very rarely and didn't trust himself to start now without it meaning more than he knew how to account for. There's a doctor, he said. I can reach him. Good, Calla said. Call him. He called him. They left the warehouse at 9. Reese stayed to manage the final documentation transfer and the handling of Cross's 3 men, who would be released to face the organizational review in the morning, not damaged, not disappeared, just processed through the internal structure that was now moving with the weight of Lena's complete record behind it. The 2 flipped contacts had already been interviewed. 1 cooperated. The other was still negotiating. Cross himself was a different matter. Cross would be managed by the organizational committee. And what that management looked like was not something Silas discussed in front of the twins or Marin, and the fact that he didn't discuss it in front of them was itself a small data point she filed without comment. Dominic drove. Lena followed in her own car. She was going directly to her daughter, which was the right call, and everyone knew it. Silas made a call during the drive that arranged a private security placement on Lena's daughter's building, effective immediately. He made it quietly, looking out the window, and when he was done, he put the phone in his pocket and said nothing about it. Marin heard it. She said nothing about it either. But she heard it. The twins were asleep before they'd gone 15 minutes. Not dramatized movie sleep, real sleep, the profound, complete unconsciousness of children whose bodies had finally overridden their minds and shut the system down. Calla's head against Knox's shoulder, Knox tipped toward the window, both of them gone so completely that the transition was visible, a before and after with no middle. Silas looked at them. He looked for a long time, turned partly in his seat, and Marin watched him look. She watched him learn their faces the way you learn something you know you've missed irreplaceable time on, with a focus that was trying to compress recovery into a single, sustained moment, knowing the moment wasn't sufficient, and doing it anyway. Calla's left-handed, she said quietly. She writes left-handed, but throws right. Knox is right-handed, but he reads with the book angled the way left-handed readers do because he learned from her. She paused. Calla's been afraid of deep water since she was 4. She doesn't show it. If you take her somewhere near open water, she'll get very quiet and she'll manage it by herself, but she won't ask for help. You have to watch for it. She paused. Knox has nightmares about 3 or 4 times a month. He doesn't wake up from them. He just talks. Not words, just sounds. If you're nearby, you don't have to do anything. He resolves them on his own, but it helps to have someone in the room. Silas had turned to look at her during this. He was very still. I'm telling you, she said, because you're going to need to know. If this is going to be, whatever this is going to be, you need the actual information, not the surface. She looked at the twins. They're extraordinary. You've seen that. But they're also 10 years old, and they're afraid of things, and they need things, and those parts of them they hide better than any child should have to. They learn to hide it, Silas said. Yes, she said, from me, from watching me manage. She paused. That's one of the things I'll spend a long time thinking about. Marin, not tonight, she said. There's too much. Tonight is getting through tonight. He looked at her. The city light moved across his face in strips as they drove. Dark, light, dark. Where do you want to go? He said. Tonight. She thought about it. The apartment was compromised. Not dangerous anymore, probably, but contaminated with the day in a way that would make sleeping there feel impossible. The safe house outside the city. A hotel. Another layer of careful invisibility. She was very tired of careful invisibility. Somewhere with a real bed, she said, and a kitchen. The twins need a real breakfast in the morning, not a warehouse and a folding table. Silas made one call. 3 minutes later, Dominic had a destination. The property was in the West Hills, not one of Silas's listed holdings, something held through 3 layers of legal separation. A house, rather than an apartment, with actual rooms and actual beds and a kitchen that had been stocked at some point by someone with practical intelligence. It smelled like cedar and clean air, and the particular neutrality of a space that had been maintained without being lived in. Marin got the twins into beds without fully waking them, which was an operation requiring the specific physical negotiation of moving sleeping children through unfamiliar space. Knox stirred enough to register that the surface under him was a mattress, and went back under. Calla opened her eyes for 3 seconds, looked at Marin, said okay, to some internal question, and closed them again. Marin stood in the hallway between the 2 rooms for a moment, then she went downstairs. Silas was in the kitchen. He'd removed his jacket and was standing at the counter looking at his shoulder in the reflection of the dark window, the assessment of a man who's been managing pain on a delay and has run out of reasons to keep delaying. The shoulder was bruised from the collarbone out across the deltoid, deep purple and swollen in a way that confirmed Marin's read from the warehouse. Not broken, but badly impacted, something strained or partially torn underneath. The doctor had come and gone at the warehouse. A quiet man with a bag who had examined the shoulder, provided a brace and medication, and given a set of instructions Silas had listened to with the compliance of someone who had no intention of following them. He was not wearing the brace. "Where is it?" she said. "In my jacket." "Put it on." He looked at her in the window's reflection. "I was going to." "You were assessing whether you needed to." She crossed to the counter and opened 2 of the cabinets until she found glasses, and then the cabinet below that until she found something with alcohol in it. Whiskey. Decent. Somebody had thoughtful taste. She poured 2, pushed one toward him. "Put the brace on, and then drink that, and we'll sit in a kitchen like actual human beings for 10 minutes. He He put the brace on. It was not graceful, reaching around to secure it with one functional arm and one compromised one. And he did not ask for help, which she'd expected, and she did not offer it, which she'd decided. He got it fitted eventually. He picked up the glass. She picked up hers. They sat at the kitchen table, opposite ends, the full length of it between them, which was not accidental on either side. And the house was quiet around them, and outside the West Hills were dark, and the city was a low orange glow below. "Lena," Marin said. "Why didn't she come to you directly?" "She tried," Silas said, 14 months ago. "She requested a private meeting. I was in Seattle. The meeting got postponed twice, and by the time I was back, Cross had already made his approach to her." He turned the glass on the table. "If I'd taken the meeting, you might have moved faster," she said. "Or you might have had a conversation that looked like disloyalty from the outside, and Cross would have used it differently." She paused. "There's no version where everything is clean." "No," he said. "She should have found a way," Marin said. "And you should have been reachable. Both things." She looked at him. "That's what running what you run costs. You become unreachable in the ways that matter." He looked at his glass. "I know." "Do you?" "I'm learning," he said, and it was different from I know in a way that was meaningful. More honest, more provisional, less claiming than conceding. Marin drank. The whiskey was good. She let it sit for a moment. "What happens now?" she said. "To the organization." "The restructuring I started 2 years ago continues," he said. "The legitimate holdings have been sufficient to run independent of the operational side for 14 months. I've been—" He paused, which was unusual for him, the pause of someone finding honest language for something they'd been doing without quite naming it. "I've been building toward an exit from the parts that can't be made clean. It's slower than it sounds. There are people whose livelihoods depend on the structure. There are obligations. It's not a switch." "How long?" she said. 2 years, he said. "Maybe 3. If the internal restructuring cross-forced actually accelerates it. Possibly less." She looked at him across the length of the table. "Kala told you. In the warehouse. She said you lose whatever this is if you go back to the old pattern." "Yes," he said. "She meant it." "I know she did." "So did I," Marin said, before she said it. He looked at her then, directly, the way he'd been careful not to look at her most of the day, with the full attention that was his most disarming quality, the thing that had pulled her in 6 years ago, the absolute quality of his focus when he turned it on a person. Like being the only thing in a room. "I know," he said. "I know you meant it. I know it's not a negotiation." He paused. I'm not standing here with a case prepared. I don't have one." He turned the glass again. "I have 2 years of documented restructuring and a plan that's been running for 14 months. And I have today. Which—" He stopped. "I understand today is not a transaction. I'm not presenting it as payment." "What are you presenting it as?" she said. He thought about it for a moment. "Evidence," he said, "of direction, not of arrival." She sat with that. "The twins," she said. "They found you because they needed to know if you were reachable. If there was something there worth—" The word Kala used was whatever this is. She gave it a name that doesn't close it. Marin looked at the table. That's her way of keeping the door open without promising it stays open. "She gets that from you," he said. Again, quietly. "Stop saying that. It's true every time." She looked up at him. The exhaustion of the day was in her face, and she knew it. She could feel the weight of it around her eyes and in the set of her shoulders, and she'd stopped managing it somewhere between the warehouse and the West Hills, and it was just there now, visible, which was not something she usually allowed. But the kitchen was quiet, and the whiskey was decent, and she was too tired to maintain the architecture of composure all the way to the bottom of the glass. "I was pregnant when I left," she said. "I didn't know until 3 weeks after. And when I found out, I sat in a bathtub in a motel in Medford, and I thought about calling you." She paused. "I thought about it for a long time." He was very still. "I decided not to," she said. "Not because I'd already built the story about the car and the dental records. That came later. Because I looked at myself in that motel bathroom, and I thought, if I call him, I go back. And going back meant they grew up inside what you were. And I couldn't." She paused. I want you to understand that it was not an easy decision. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, and I made it alone in a motel bathroom, and I've been living with it for 6 years. I know, he said. His voice was low and had lost most of its flatness, what remained underneath being something she had almost forgotten existed in him. And it was the right decision, she said, for who you were then, for what the situation was then. She paused. I don't know who you are now. I've had 24 hours of extreme circumstances, which is not a sufficient sample. No, he said. So I'm not... She stopped, restarted. I'm not closing a door. I'm also not opening one. I'm saying, I don't know yet. And I need you to understand that I don't know yet is the most honest thing I can give you right now, and it might be the most honest thing I can give you for a long time. He looked at her across the kitchen table. It's enough, he said. It's not generous, she said. I know, he said. It's still enough. She finished her whiskey, set the glass down. The kitchen settled around them, the cedar smell of it, the low orange city outside. The twins are going to want to see you, she said. Regularly. That's already decided, but not by me, by them. You don't have to negotiate for access, they've decided. She paused. But it happens at a pace I'm comfortable with, and the moment I see them being shaped in a direction that scares me, you say so, he said, and I stop, without argument. She looked at him. I have no right to argue, he said. I have no ground to stand on that makes my judgment about their safety more valid than yours. You've been their parent for 10 years. I've been their parent for... He paused. Somewhere between yesterday morning and right now. He held her gaze. You set the pace. I'll be there at whatever pace that is. She nodded once, accepted that, filed it. Get some sleep, she said. She stood up, took the glasses to the sink. Your shoulder needs it. Marin. She stopped, didn't turn. I'm sorry, he said. Not for everything. For enough things that a complete accounting would take longer than tonight. He paused. But I'm sorry. Specifically and without case building, I'm sorry. She stood at the sink for a moment. Then she said, I know. And she went upstairs. 6 months later, the Vane building's executive floor was different. Not dramatically. Not in the ways that would register to anyone who hadn't known it before. The furniture was the same. The view was the same gray to blue of Portland depending on the weather. But 2 of the 6 businesses operating under the holding company's umbrella had been sold, cleanly, to parties who had no connection to Silas's previous operational life. A third was in the process. The proceeds had moved through a legal trust into what the paperwork called a victim support network, and what Calla had called, at the kitchen table of the West Hills house 3 months ago, the more accurate version of what he owed. He had not argued with the phrasing. The twins came to this building on the first Saturday of every month. They came through the main lobby, which meant the security staff knew their faces. And Dominic met them at the elevator, and they went to the 41st floor where Silas kept a room set aside that had a second-hand couch and a work table and a whiteboard that Knox had covered in a color-coded system Silas had stopped pretending to fully follow. Calla used the whiteboard. Knox used the table. They worked, and Silas worked, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes the room was just 4 walls around 3 people doing separate things in the same space, which was a kind of ordinary that Silas had not known he was capable of, and which arrived each first Saturday with a weight he had stopped trying to name. Reese ran the organizational committee now, with oversight that was cleaner than it had ever been, and would take another 18 months to be clean enough. Lena Marsh had returned to her position after a formal internal review, which was not comfortable for anyone involved, and was the right outcome regardless. Her daughter was finishing her recovery and had started playing soccer again, which Lena had mentioned once, briefly, in a way that said everything about what the last year had cost her. Cross's situation had been resolved by the organizational committee in February, in a process Silas had not been part of by specific design, and the result had been the kind of permanent retirement that the organization reserved for people who had caused sufficient harm that standard exits were insufficient. Silas had not asked for details. He had not needed to. Marin lived 3 miles from the Vane building in an apartment she had chosen herself. Not the Selwood apartment, which she'd given up, but a new one, different neighborhood, a kitchen with more light. The twins were enrolled in school under names that were theirs and no longer needed to be hidden. They were doing, their teachers reported, remarkably well, which was the kind of understatement that made Marin press her hand flat on the table and breathe for a second before responding. She and Silas spoke most days, sometimes briefly, sometimes not. It was not a restored relationship, and it was not yet clear what it was becoming. It was a conversation that had not stopped, which was more than she'd expected and less than she'd feared, and she had learned to sit with the ambiguity of that without trying to resolve it prematurely. In April, he appeared at her apartment on a Sunday afternoon with a paper bag containing groceries and no plan, which was the least Silas Vane thing that had ever happened in Marin's presence. He stood at her door with the bag and said, "I didn't know what you needed. I guessed." She looked at the bag. "You bought soup." "It's November," he said. "It's April," she said. A pause. "I thought it was—" He stopped. The ghost of something moved across his face. "And in the building too much." She took the bag from him. "Come in," she said. "I'll make something with it." Came in. On a Thursday evening in May, Silas stood on the rooftop of the Vane building. He had converted the space in March, removed the old mechanical housing, brought in soil and planters and growing things, mostly at Calla's direction and partly at Knox's systematic instruction regarding what grew in this climate and what didn't. It was not beautiful yet. It was going to be. The planters had things in them that were beginning to come up, small and green and tentative, and on a warm enough May evening, the view from up here was the city in its best light. The river catching the last sun, the hills going soft and dark in the east. Marin came through the rooftop door at 6:15. He'd known she would. They'd talked about it that morning. A real plan. One of the first ones they'd made that wasn't structured around the twins' schedule or an organizational necessity, but was just the two of them agreeing to be in the same place. She stopped a few feet from the door and looked at the planters, at the small green things coming up, at the view. "Calla chose the tomatoes," he said. Knox overruled her on placement. Twice. "Knox is usually right about placement," Marin said. "I know," he said. "I told Calla that." "How did that go?" She agreed and then reorganized the entire south section to prove she'd arrived at the same conclusion independently. Marin laughed. An actual laugh, which she didn't always get to on the first try around him, which was one of the things they were still working on. The muscle memory of what it felt like to be at ease in the same space. It was coming. It came at different rates on different days, like most things worth having. She came to stand beside him. They stood at the railing with the city below and the sky above and the planters behind them with their small, tenacious green things working against the weather. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at the river. "Not for an answer tonight," he said. "I'm not asking for tonight. I'm asking you to keep it somewhere and let it be a question that stays open." He paused. I know this isn't a restoration. I know it's something else, something that's still, He stopped. He was not good at this, the unstructured articulation of things that didn't have operational language, and he'd stopped pretending otherwise sometime in the last 6 months, which was both difficult and significantly better. "I know it's still being built," he said, "and I'm asking if you'll let it keep being built. Not into something specific, just kept, ongoing." She looked at the city, at the river catching the last light, at the rooftop garden that was going to need another 2 seasons to look like what Calla had drawn on the whiteboard in the 41st floor room. She thought about a motel bathroom in Medford, a car on fire and a story told in dental records and 6 years of careful, constructed small. She thought about 2 children walking into an elevator that shouldn't have admitted them, carrying folders, carrying evidence, carrying the specific fearlessness of people who had decided that the truth of their origin was something they had a right to seek. She thought about Knox's hand on the back of her jacket in the warehouse, Calla's hand on Knox's arm after Lena's call. 2 10-year-olds on the floor of a concrete room, one writing and one watching, waiting for the adults to arrive at what the children had already understood. "Yes," she said, "let it keep being built." He didn't say anything. He looked at the river. After a moment, the rooftop door opened and the twins came through it. They'd been in the building, there'd been a whiteboard session, Knox had a new notebook under his arm, and Calla was mid-sentence about something structural in the organizational oversight framework that Silas needed to reconsider, which she did not pause to acknowledge the rooftop required. Knox stopped beside Marin. He looked at the view. He looked at his father standing at the railing. Something settled in his face. Not dramatic, just a settling. The specific expression of someone who has been holding a question for a long time and has decided, incrementally, that the answer might be sufficient. He went to stand beside Silas at the railing. On Silas's left, Marin on his right. Calla coming to stand beside Marin, still talking, now gesturing at the planters with a critique about the tomato stakes. And Marin listened with half her attention and gave the other half to the river. And the four of them stood on the rooftop of the building that still bore his name with the city below, and the green things growing behind them, and the May sky going gold above the hills. Nobody took a photograph. Nobody marked it formally. It was just an evening, just a rooftop, just four people standing in the light that was left. The twins had walked into his office to find out if their father was reachable. 6 months later, he was still learning the answer. So was she. So quietly and without performance were they all.